Story 1. The Clock That Ran Backwards. Robert Hayes had been driving trucks for 37 years. He knew the highways of America like most people know the layout of their own homes. Every exit, every rest stop, every curve in the road that appeared in the darkness. He'd seen things that would make ordinary people question their sanity, but Robert attributed most of those moments to exhaustion or the strange way that highway lights played tricks on tired eyes at 3 in the morning. That changed on a Tuesday night in March of 2023, somewhere between Bakersfield and Fresno on Interstate 5. Robert was hauling a load of refrigerated produce destined for distribution centers in Northern California. His rig, a Peterbilt 389 he'd owned for 8 years, hummed along at a steady 65 miles per hour. The engine was well maintained, the brakes responsive, the air ride suspension smooth as butter. His logbook was current, his medical card up to date, and he'd slept a full 8 hours before starting this run. There was no reason for what would happen next. It was 2 in the morning when Robert first noticed something odd about his dashboard clock. He always kept it synchronized with his phone, a habit developed from years of needing precise time records for his logbook. The time on his truck's digital display read 2:14. His cell phone, sitting in the cup holder, read 2:15. A minute's difference wasn't unusual, but Robert had noticed the clock ticking backwards for the last several seconds. It went from 2:14 and 30 seconds to 2:14 and 25 seconds. Then to 2:14 and 20. It was counting backwards instead of forwards. Robert tapped the dashboard screen. Sometimes these electronic systems glitched. He'd had a GPS lockup on him before, had seen radio displays cycle through static. Electronics failed, that was normal. But the clock continued its backwards march. 2:14 and 15 seconds, 2:14 and 10. Robert felt the first genuine stirring of unease in his chest. He pressed the reset button on the clock. Nothing changed. The countdown continued. He glanced at his cell phone again. It now read 2:17. The gap was widening. His truck's clock said 2:13 and 30 seconds and falling. Robert's hands tightened on the steering wheel. This wasn't possible. Clocks didn't run backwards. And they certainly didn't run backwards at a faster rate than normal time was supposed to move forward. His phone should be aging faster than a backwards running clock, but instead the opposite was happening. Robert considered pulling over at the next rest stop, but something about this compelled him to keep driving. He wanted to see how far this would go, wanted to understand what was happening. The highway ahead looked normal. The reflectors in the road markers gleamed white in his headlights. No traffic in either direction at this hour. The dark landscape stretched out on both sides of the interstate, fallow fields and occasional stands of bare trees. Everything appeared exactly as it should. Yet Robert felt as though he'd driven into some pocket of reality where the normal rules had been suspended. His CB radio crackled to life. Robert didn't remember turning it on, and he didn't remember it being off either. A voice came through, male and measured, with a peculiar flatness to its tone. "Westbound traffic, this is dispatch. Report your mileage marker." Robert reached for the radio, confused. That wasn't normal procedure. Dispatchers didn't typically use the CB for routine communications, and no official dispatch would be monitoring this frequency. He keyed the microphone. "This is freight hauler, Peterbilt northbound, mile marker 237. Robert gave his standard handle and location, though he was north, not westbound. The response came immediately, which was wrong. There was no delay, no other voices, no static, just that flat, emotionless reply. "Correct. Continue to mile marker 237. You are approaching the window." Robert released the microphone. His dashboard clock now read 2:12. His phone read 2:22. Nearly a 10-minute disparity. His hands were shaking on the steering wheel. He considered this carefully. If his truck's clock had been running backwards for the past few minutes, and if he'd been driving at highway speed, then how long had this been happening? How much actual time had passed? Was he aging normally while his truck's clock went backwards? Or was the time dilation somehow affecting him as well? The landscape ahead suddenly changed. Robert saw mile marker 237, the reflective sign glowing white in his headlights. But something was wrong with the marker's appearance. It looked faded, worn, as if it had been exposed to decades of weather rather than normal wear and tear. The flat farmland was gone. Now Robert saw nothing but darkness on both sides of the highway. No lights from distant houses, no fields, no trees. Just an absolute void of empty space that seemed to swallow his headlights before they could illuminate anything. His dashboard clock read 2:11. His phone read 2:23. A figure appeared on the shoulder of the highway. Robert's heart seized in his chest. It was a truck driver standing perfectly still facing the road. The man wore dated clothing, or at least what seemed dated to Robert's modern eye. Old Levi's, a faded flannel shirt, a trucker cap with a patch on it that Robert couldn't quite make out. The driver was standing completely motionless, staring directly at Robert's truck as it approached. His face was blank, devoid of expression. His eyes didn't follow the truck. He simply stood there, facing forward as if he were waiting for something. Robert slowed the truck without thinking about it. His foot moved to the brake pedal almost involuntarily. The figure didn't move. As Robert passed, the stationary driver's head didn't turn. The eyes, when Robert got a clear look at them, seemed to stare into the middle distance, focusing on nothing. There was something profoundly wrong about the figure's stillness, about the way it stood with such perfect, unnatural posture. No living human could maintain that kind of rigid immobility. Robert pushed the accelerator. His Peterbilt surged forward, away from the mile marker and the impossible figure. His dashboard clock read 2:10 and 15 seconds. His phone read 2:25. The gap was still widening. Robert wanted to call someone, to reach out over the CB and tell someone about what he was seeing, but what would he say? He knew how that would sound. Another exhausted trucker, sleep-deprived and seeing things. The CB crackled again. The same flat voice returned, "Freight hauler, you have passed the window. Return to mile marker 237. You must return to the window." "Negative," Robert said, surprised to hear his voice remain steady. Continuing north. "You cannot continue. You must return. The window is closing." Robert watched his dashboard clock. It now read 1:50, 2 hours into the past from where he'd started. His phone read 2:30, 30 minutes ahead. He was caught in some kind of temporal distortion, some pocket where time was being twisted in opposite directions. The only sensible thing to do was to keep driving forward, to get away from mile marker 237, to drive out of whatever impossible situation had engulfed him. But the landscape around him had changed again. He was no longer on Interstate 5. The road ahead was smaller, narrower, almost rural in character. Yet Robert was certain he hadn't taken any exit. He'd been driving straight down the highway. The mile markers had changed, gone from 237 to 241 to 245, progressing normally in one direction at least. But the road surface and the surrounding landscape had slowly transformed. The vegetation became denser. Pine trees crowded the shoulders of the road. His dashboard clock now read 1:40. His phone read 2:35, nearly a 2-hour gap. Robert gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had gone white. He was hyperventilating, breathing too quickly, too shallowly. He forced himself to slow his breathing. Panic would only make things worse. He needed to stay alert, needed to keep driving. Then he saw lights ahead. A gas station, old-fashioned, with pumps that looked like they belonged to a different era. A small building behind the pumps, windows dark except for a single light in what looked like the office. Robert saw no vehicles, no signs of life. But there was a mile marker near the gas station. He drove past slowly, noted that it read 220. He'd gone backwards from 237 to 220. That was impossible. He'd been driving forward, accelerating even. Robert considered stopping at the gas station, felt a moment of desperate hope that perhaps the people inside could explain what was happening. But something about the quality of the light, the absolute emptiness of the place, stopped him. He continued driving. His dashboard clock had stopped changing. It remained fixed at 1:40. His phone continued to progress forward, now reading 2:40. The gap was absolute now, not widening, just a static 1-hour separation between two different measurements of time. The road began to curve. Robert drove around a long bend and found himself back on a highway that looked like Interstate 5. The landscape opened up. Fields appeared on both sides. The mile markers returned to their proper sequence. His dashboard clock suddenly updated to 2:41. His phone also read 2:41. They were synchronized again. Robert spent the next 3 hours driving, not knowing what else to do. He was terrified to stop, terrified that stopping would trap him somehow. At 5 in the morning, with the sky beginning to lighten in the east, he pulled into a truck stop in Fresno. He sat in his cab for 20 minutes, hands shaking, trying to process what had happened. The other truckers looked normal. The world looked normal. But nothing would ever feel normal to Robert again. He completed his delivery, dropping off the refrigerated produce at the warehouse. The dock workers seemed unconcerned by his distracted manner. They scanned his bills of lading, logged his arrival time, and sent him on his way. Robert drove to a motel near the highway and booked a room for 2 days. He needed time to think, to rationalize what had occurred. He reviewed his logbook, looking for inconsistencies. The entry showed he'd completed the drive in the normal time frame. No missing hours, no unexplained gaps. Yet his watch, which had been set to the same time as his phone, showed a discrepancy of 2 hours. Either his watch had malfunctioned, or something genuinely impossible had occurred. Robert never returned to that stretch of highway. He altered his routes, took different paths, even accepted lower-paying loads to avoid that particular route. Years later, long after he'd retired, Robert still couldn't explain what happened on that March night. He'd never reported it to anyone. Who would believe him? But he knew the truth. Somewhere on Interstate 5 between Bakersfield and Fresno, there existed a place where time didn't work the way it was supposed to work. A place where clocks ran backwards and impossible figures waited on the shoulder of the road. Robert never found the courage to drive through it again. Sometimes late at night he wondered if that other trucker on the shoulder was still standing there, waiting for someone else to pass through the window, waiting to drag another driver into that temporal nightmare. The thought made Robert grateful for his retirement. Story 2. The Mile That Never Ended. Patricia Sullivan had been trucking for 29 years, and she prided herself on never missing a delivery date. Her reputation in the industry was solid, reliable, punctual. She drove a Volvo VNL with custom sleeper cab and leather seats. Patricia kept her truck clean, her logbook accurate, and her attitude professional. In July of 2023, she was hauling automotive parts from Detroit to Houston, a run she'd made at least 200 times over her career. She knew every truck stop along the route, every way station, every stretch of highway that got heavy with traffic, and every stretch that was usually clear. But on this particular night, somewhere along I-75 in northern Georgia, the highway itself seemed to change its mind about what it was. Patricia had made this drive countless times. The section of I-75 between Atlanta and Chattanooga was familiar enough to drive half asleep, which she wasn't doing because she was a professional. But at around midnight, as she was approaching what should have been mile marker 195, Patricia noticed something odd. The landscape wasn't changing. For the past 15 minutes, she'd been looking at the same terrain, the same pine trees, the same grassy embankment on the right side of the highway, the same rocky cut on the left where the highway had been blasted through the hill. Nothing was moving. Nothing was changing. Patricia checked her GPS. According to the device mounted on her dashboard, she was traveling at a constant 60 miles per hour. The distance readout showed she'd traveled the appropriate distance over the time elapsed. But her eyes weren't lying. The landscape was static. Patricia reached for her CB radio. Maybe another trucker had reported something about road construction or an accident that had backed up traffic. She was curious, though not yet alarmed. Curious meant she could investigate, could understand the problem. "This is Smooth Operator, looking for any traffic on I-75 northbound mile marker 195 area. Anybody out there?" She waited for a response. Nothing but static. She tried again. "Smooth Operator calling anyone on I-75. What's the traffic looking like northbound?" Still nothing. That was unusual. There was always someone on the CB at this hour. Always another trucker heading somewhere. Always someone willing to talk about road conditions or just pass the time. Patricia focused her attention on the road ahead. Still the same trees, still the same landscape. She applied the brakes slightly, testing them. They were responsive. Her truck was running normally. The fuel gauge showed 3/4 full. Everything seemed fine except for the peculiar fact that nothing appeared to be changing around her. Patricia gripped the steering wheel and accelerated slightly. 65 miles per hour now. She watched the mile markers. 195 came up on her right. She'd just passed it moments before. She should have been moving toward 196, but there was mile marker 195 again. She'd somehow circled around and come back to the same marker. That wasn't possible. Patricia's hands were beginning to shake. She forced herself to calm down. There had to be a rational explanation. The mile markers were temporary, perhaps for construction. They'd been rearranged. That made sense. Except the road didn't feel like it had curved. She hadn't made any turns. She was certain she'd been traveling in a straight line. Patricia pulled out her phone and called her dispatcher. The connection was clear, no static or interference. "Hey Jerry, this is Patricia. I'm passing mile marker 195 on I-75 and I'm experiencing some weird stuff with the terrain. Might be an accident ahead or something blocking the road." Jerry's voice came back immediately. "Smooth Operator, you're currently 8 miles north of mile marker 195. You've been making good time. No accidents reported on that stretch. Keep moving north." Patricia pressed the accelerator again. 70 miles per hour now. She was moving forward quickly, closing the distance, accelerating hard. She watched for mile marker 196, then 197, then 198. Everything seemed normal again. The landscape was changing now. She could see different trees, different hills. The curved landscape was shifting as it should. Patricia allowed herself to relax. Whatever had happened, it had passed. She continued north at a steady 70 miles per hour. Then she saw it. Mile marker 195 again. It was impossible. She'd driven north for several minutes at highway speed. She should have been miles past this marker. Yet there it was again on her right side, just where it had been. Patricia felt a wave of dread wash over her. She pulled off at the next exit, which appeared almost immediately. She'd driven maybe a quarter mile before seeing the exit sign. But the exit seemed familiar. too familiar. It was the exit where she'd thought about pulling over earlier, a small truck stop with a red awning. Except she had definitely seen it from the other direction, heading north from mile marker 195. That shouldn't be possible. Patricia pulled into the truck stop and shut off her engine. She sat in the quiet cab, trying to think. Her GPS showed she was exactly where the satellite said she was. The distance counter on her odometer showed the miles she'd traveled. By all objective measures, she'd driven a normal distance at highway speed. But she kept arriving back at mile marker 195. Patricia opened her driver's door and climbed down from the cab. The truck stop looked normal, a small building with a convenience store, fuel pumps. A few other trucks parked in the back lot. Ordinary. Nothing seemed wrong with the place, yet Patricia felt strongly that she should not go inside. Instead, she got back into her truck and started the engine again. She would drive north more carefully this time. She would watch the mile markers. She would verify that they were indeed incrementing as they should. Patricia pulled back onto the highway, heading north. The landscape was moving now, changing appropriately. She drove for 5 minutes. 10 minutes. Mile markers counted upward. 195 to 196 to 197, then 198, then 199, then 200. Patricia felt relief flooding through her. Whatever had been happening was over. She accelerated to 70 miles per hour again and settled back into her normal driving rhythm. 20 minutes later, mile marker 195 appeared on her right. Patricia's hands shook on the steering wheel. This time, she didn't doubt what she was seeing. This time, she knew for certain. She was trapped on this stretch of highway, caught in some kind of loop or dimension where she kept arriving back at the same location no matter how far she drove. Patricia pulled her phone out and called Jerry again. "Jerry, I need you to listen to me carefully. I've passed mile marker 195 6 times now. I'm driving north at highway speed, covering the appropriate distance, but I keep coming back to this same marker. I need to know what's happening." There was a long pause. Then Jerry said, "Patricia, are you feeling okay? You sound panicked. You've been on the road a long time. Maybe you need to take a break, get some sleep." "I'm perfectly fine. This is not hallucination. I'm trapped here. I keep passing the same marker over and over." "I'll check the system," Jerry said. "Hang on." Patricia waited. She continued driving north at 65 miles per hour, watching the landscape. The mile markers clicked upward. She was counting them now, tracking each one. Mile marker 196, mile marker 197. "Patricia, I've got visual confirmation from a traffic camera about 3 miles north of where you are now. You passed there 20 minutes ago. You're definitely moving forward." Patricia felt her reality fracturing. The camera said she was 3 miles ahead, but she was looking at mile marker 198 right now, which should be only 2 miles north of the point where she supposedly was. "The marker says 198, she reported to Jerry. "No, that's not possible. Your GPS says you're at mile marker 201. Patricia looked at her GPS. Jerry was right. The device displayed 201. But outside her window, the physical marker said 198. She was being told 2 different locations simultaneously by 2 different sources, both of which should be reliable. Patricia took her exit again, pulling into the same truck stop with the red awning. This time she got out and walked to the marker, looking at it closely. Mile marker 195. But when she turned around and looked back at her truck, she saw mile markers in all directions. 195 on her left, 195 on her right, multiple markers all saying the same number. And when she looked toward the highway, she could see mile marker 200 in the distance. And beyond that, others, all visible at once, as if space itself had compressed or folded. Patricia ran back to her truck. She was hyperventilating, her vision swimming. She started the engine and drove back onto the highway in the opposite direction, heading south. Within minutes, she found herself heading north again, unable to turn around, the road curving impossibly. Desperate, she tried random exits, taking them wherever they appeared. Each exit led to the same truck stop. Each truck stop had the same red awning. Each time she pulled back onto the highway, she found herself between mile markers 195 and 200, unable to escape, unable to progress. Patricia eventually pulled into a rest area and called her dispatcher. She told him everything. Jerry convinced her to drive to the next town and get a hotel room. She somehow managed to escape the loop after driving for 6 more hours. The moment she crossed into downtown Atlanta, everything changed. The highway released her. Mile markers began incrementing normally. Her GPS and her visual observations synchronized again. Patricia completed her delivery to Houston, but she never drove I-75 through Georgia again. She took different routes, added miles to her deliveries, reduced her pay rather than drive through that stretch of highway. The mile marker 195 section became a place she couldn't bring herself to drive through again. Other truckers talked about it sometimes on the CB, about the weird section of I-75, about how some drivers got stuck there and couldn't explain it. Patricia never spoke about it to anyone else, but she knew. That stretch of Georgia wasn't part of the same world as the rest of the highway. It was somewhere else. Somewhere that didn't follow normal rules about distance and direction. Story 3. The Radio Voices. Marcus Collins had been driving trucks for 42 years. He'd seen the industry change from the days of old-fashioned logbooks to electronic logging devices. He'd driven through sandstorms and blizzards and torrential rains that made the highway nearly invisible. He'd pulled off roofs and dealt with mechanical failures and brake problems. But he'd never experienced anything that frightened him until the night in September of 2023 when his CB radio started picking up voices that weren't speaking English. Marcus was a simple man who'd spent most of his adult life alone on the highways of America. He didn't mind the solitude. His truck was his home and the road was his family. He was hauling freight from Chicago to Memphis on this particular night, moving steadily down I-41 with a full load of packaged goods and industrial supplies. It was around 1 in the morning when Marcus first heard the voices on the CB. His radio was tuned to Channel 19, the standard channel for truckers to communicate. He'd had the radio on but silent for the past few hours. No traffic, no other drivers transmitting. Just the occasional static burst. Then the voices started. They were speaking in what sounded like a language Marcus didn't recognize. The sounds weren't quite like any language he'd ever heard. The words seemed to be formed in ways that human vocal cords shouldn't be able to produce. There were too many consonants clustered together. The cadence was wrong. The rhythm was wrong. Yet they were definitely words. Definitely language. Just not any language Marcus had ever encountered. Marcus switched to Channel 16 to see if the voices were on that frequency too. They were. He switched to Channel 14. The voices were there as well. Every channel he tried had those same strange voices speaking in that impossible language. He turned off his CB entirely, but he could still hear them, faintly, as if they were somehow penetrating through the radio itself even when it was powered down. Marcus turned the radio back on and switched to Channel 19. The voices continued their strange cadence, speaking to each other in words that seemed to slide off his comprehension. He tried to make out individual words, to find patterns, to understand even a fragment of what was being said. But nothing connected. The sounds simply remained alien, other fundamentally incomprehensible. Marcus considered turning the radio off completely and leaving it off, but something prevented him from doing that. He wanted to understand. He wanted to know what was being broadcast on the trucker's emergency frequency. He wanted to know where these voices were coming from. Marcus pressed the button on his microphone. "This is Blue Thunder, Channel 19. Who's transmitting? I don't recognize that language." The voices continued as if he hadn't spoken. They didn't respond or acknowledge. They simply continued their strange conversation with each other. Marcus tried again. "This is Blue Thunder. What's your location? What's your rig?" Still no response. The voices kept speaking their impossible words. Marcus checked his mirrors. The highway was empty. No headlights ahead, no headlights behind. Just the dark stretch of I-41, the reflectors in the road markers glowing white in his headlights. The voices continued. One voice would speak, then another would respond, then a third voice would enter the conversation. They were having an actual dialogue, complete and intricate, and none of it made any sense to Marcus's ears. He was starting to feel a deep sense of wrongness, a bone-level discomfort that made the hair on his arms stand up. He decided to pull off at the next exit and find a truck stop where other drivers were present. Maybe they could explain what he was hearing. Marcus took the next exit and found a 24-hour truck stop. He pulled into the parking lot and shut off his engine. The voices immediately stopped. The CB was silent. Marcus waited for them to return, but they didn't. He sat in the cab of his truck for 20 minutes, listening to the empty static of his CB. Other truckers were parking their rigs around him. He could see them walking into the truck stop diner. Everything was normal here. The voices were gone. Had he imagined them? Sleep deprivation could cause hallucinations. Marcus checked his logbook. He'd been driving for 12 hours. He'd taken a break 6 hours ago at a previous truck stop. His hours were legal. He wasn't driving while exhausted. So why had he experienced what seemed like an auditory hallucination? Marcus decided to eat something and rest in his cab for a while. He went into the truck stop, got a coffee and a sandwich, and sat in a booth. Several other drivers were scattered throughout the diner. Marcus almost asked one of them if they'd heard any strange broadcasts on the CB, but he stopped himself. He knew how that would sound. He finished his coffee and returned to his truck. When he climbed into the cab and started the engine, the voices immediately returned. They were right where they'd been before, talking in that strange, inhuman language. Speaking urgently now, their tone more agitated. Marcus gripped the steering wheel. This wasn't a hallucination. Hallucinations didn't follow patterns like this. They didn't turn on and off based on location. They didn't have internal logic and consistency. Marcus pulled back onto the highway. He was about 200 miles from Memphis. If he drove through the night, he could reach Memphis by dawn. Then he could figure out what was happening. He accelerated to 70 miles per hour, trying to ignore the voices. But they were getting louder, more insistent. The strange syllables seemed to multiply. Multiple overlapping voices were speaking now. 10 voices, 20, 30. A choir of impossible sound. Marcus reached for his CB, intending to turn it off entirely, but something stopped him. He needed to know. He keyed his microphone. "Who are you? Where are you transmitting from?" This time, one of the voices changed its tone, shifted direction, began responding. Marcus couldn't understand the words, but the quality of the voice was different. It was addressing him, speaking to him directly. Marcus's hands were shaking on the steering wheel. He was terrified and fascinated in equal measure. "I don't understand you," he said into the microphone. The voice responded. The words were still impossible, still alien. But there was rhythm now, pattern, repetition. The voice was trying to communicate, trying to make Marcus understand something. "Where are you calling from?" Marcus asked again. The voice suddenly shifted into English. The accent was thick, guttural, but the words were unmistakable. "You are on our road now. This is our radio. This is our voice." Marcus's blood turned to ice water. The voice continued. You drive through our places, you pass through our markers, you see our signs. This is our world. You are very far from home, Marcus Collins. Very far indeed. Marcus jerked the steering wheel, nearly veering into the median. How did it know his name? He'd never given his name. His handle was Blue Thunder. He'd never mentioned his real name on the CB. What do you want? Marcus managed to say. We want to know what you are doing in our world. We want to know why you passed through without acknowledging us. We want to know if you are willing to pay the toll. What toll? I don't understand. The toll is yourself. Leave your body, we will collect it. You can keep driving. Your truck will keep moving. But you will be gone, replaced by what we send back. Marcus screamed. He slammed on the accelerator. His truck surged forward to 90 miles per hour. The voices on the CB became a cacophony of terrible sounds, all of them speaking at once, all of them laughing in that harsh, alien way. Marcus kept driving. He passed mile marker after mile marker. The voices continued. They told him things. They said they'd been watching him drive this stretch of highway for years. They said they'd taken other drivers. They said the toll had to be paid. Marcus drove for hours, terrified to stop, terrified of what he would find if he looked in his mirrors or examined his hands. Were they his? Were they real? Was he real? At dawn, Marcus pulled into a truck stop in Memphis. He collapsed on the CB. The voices were still there, but they were quieter now, almost satisfied. Marcus didn't complete his delivery. He abandoned his truck and his cargo in the parking lot and called a taxi to take him to the airport. He flew back to Chicago and never drove trucks again. He never called his dispatcher to explain what happened. He never filed a formal incident report. But years later, when other drivers asked him what had happened, Marcus would always say the same thing. I drove through a place that wasn't part of this world, and something there tried to collect a payment. I didn't pay it, but I didn't feel like I got away either. I think it's still keeping track. I think someday it'll collect what I owe. Story 4. The facility that wasn't on the map. David Nakamura had been driving trucks for 25 years. He was meticulous about his routes, his maintenance, his logbooks. He was a man who trusted numbers and systems. He drove a Kenworth W900, a classic model he'd owned for 12 years. The truck was in perfect condition. The engine had been rebuilt 3 years ago and maintained religiously ever since. David was hauling refrigerated cargo from Sacramento to Las Vegas in August of 2023. It was a straightforward run on I-80. He'd made this run at least 200 times. He knew the route like he knew the route between his bedroom and kitchen. David was driving through the desert at 2 in the morning. The stars were visible above, a blanket of light against the black sky. The highway was empty. He was approaching a section of highway that he'd never particularly noticed before, a stretch where the landscape seemed particularly flat and monotonous. But on this night, David saw lights ahead. Brilliant lights. Not the normal lights of a town or a small truck stop. These were industrial lights, the kind used on construction sites or at large facilities. They illuminated a massive structure set back from the highway. The building was enormous, at least as large as a large factory or warehouse. It was brightly lit but showed no signs of activity. David checked his GPS and his route planner. There was no facility marked at this location. His maps showed nothing but empty desert. Yet there it was, a massive building set back perhaps a mile from the highway, surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with razor wire. The fence ran parallel to the highway for several miles. David could see it stretching both ahead and behind, a metallic barrier separating the facility from the world. He slowed his truck and stared at the structure as he drove past. The building had no visible windows. It was a solid block of concrete and metal. Industrial. military-looking, designed to be inconspicuous and functional. David's curiosity was piqued. He'd driven this route hundreds of times and he'd never seen this facility. That seemed impossible. How could such a large structure exist right next to the highway without being on any map? David continued driving for another 15 minutes, watching his odometer, counting down the distance. He wanted to see if the facility had any markers, any indication of what it was or who operated it. But there was nothing, just the fence and the lit structure beyond it. David pulled over at a small paved area that served as a scenic overlook. He got out of his truck and pulled out his phone. He called his dispatcher. "Jerry, I'm seeing a large facility next to I-80, probably 10 miles west of Winnemucca. Do you have any information about that? It's not on any of my route planners." Jerry told him to hold on while he checked the system. After a long pause, Jerry came back. "I don't see anything on the manifest. There's nothing marked in that area. You sure about the location?" David described the facility more clearly. The size, the lighting, the razor wire fence. Jerry listened and then said something that chilled David's blood. "Dave, I'm looking at your coordinates right now. There's nothing out there but empty desert. No facilities within 100 miles of your location. You need to get some rest. You're seeing things." "I'm not seeing things," David said. But he was starting to doubt himself. He looked back at the facility. It was still there, still lit, still enormous, still clearly visible in the darkness of the desert. David got back into his truck and continued driving. He tried to put the facility out of his mind. Maybe it was some kind of classified government installation, and it simply wasn't on civilian maps. That would explain why it wasn't showing up in his navigation system. That was possible. That was reasonable. David drove for another hour. He decided to exit I-80 and take a smaller highway that would allow him to circle around the area. He wanted to get a better look at the facility, wanted to photograph it perhaps, wanted some kind of evidence that it actually existed. He took exit 7-3 and found himself on a smaller highway that seemed to be taking him roughly in the direction of the facility. David drove carefully, watching the landscape, trying to orient himself. The facility should have come into view after a few minutes of driving, but it didn't. The desert was empty. The road was straight. No lights appeared in the distance. The facility had vanished. David drove for 10 minutes, then 15, then 20. The facility wasn't appearing. He checked his GPS. He was definitely heading in the correct general direction. He should be able to see something by now. But there was nothing but empty desert in every direction. David turned around and headed back to I-80. He felt a sense of creeping dread. The facility had been enormous. It wasn't possible that he'd somehow gotten turned around and missed it. Yet there it was, gone, as if it had never existed. David got back on I-80 and drove for another 15 minutes. Then he saw it again. The facility was there on the other side of the highway now, still massive, still lit, still enclosed by the razor wire fence. David felt vertigo. This wasn't making sense. He'd circled around and come back from a different direction. The facility should have moved, but he was seeing it from a different angle now. The front of the facility faced the opposite direction. How was that possible? Had he somehow driven in a circle without realizing it? Had his GPS failed and he'd driven perpendicular to the highway? David decided to approach the facility directly. He took the next exit and drove toward the fence. The ground was rough, sandy. His truck bounced slightly as he drove, but he kept going, heading straight for the gate in the fence. The facility grew larger and more imposing as he approached. The lights were painfully bright at this closer range. David could see no details of the building itself, just smooth concrete walls and a flat roof. No doors, no windows, no identifying markings. just a solid structure designed to be impenetrable. David pulled right up to the gate. It was a large metal gate set into the fence, secured with a chain and lock. David got out of his truck. He walked to the gate and looked through it. Beyond the gate was a small gravel access road leading to the building. The building sat perhaps 200 yards beyond the gate. David shouted, "Hello? Is anyone there? I need to know what this facility is." His voice echoed across the empty desert. No response came. No lights turned on inside the building. No one appeared at a window. The facility remained silent and dark inside despite the intense external lighting. David returned to his truck. He sat in the cab and tried to think about what he was experiencing. This facility wasn't on any map. It appeared and disappeared depending on his position. It wasn't clearly visible from multiple angles, and when he approached it directly, it seemed to exist in its own isolated space, unconnected to the surrounding desert. David felt certain that if he opened that gate and drove toward the building, something terrible would happen. He didn't know why he felt that way, but the sensation was overwhelming. It was a primal warning, an instinct that screamed at him to stay away. David drove back to I-80 and continued toward Las Vegas. In his mirrors, he watched the facility grow smaller and fade from view. He completed his delivery and accepted a return load heading back to Sacramento. But when he reached the section of highway where the facility was located, he took a different route, adding hours to his drive. He never returned to that particular stretch of I-80 again. Years later, David would search the internet looking for information about any facility in that location. He found nothing. No government installations, no classified military bases, no explanation. David eventually retired and moved to Hawaii, where he spent his days trying to forget the impossible facility in the desert and what it had implied about the world he'd been living in. The facility suggested that reality was much larger and stranger than he'd previously assumed, and that there were places in the world that existed outside the normal rules of geography and logic. Story 5. The Identical Stretch. Susan Mitchell had been driving trucks for 31 years. She was a woman who paid attention to details. She noticed things about the roads she traveled. The peculiar bent sign near exit 43 on I-76, the way the sun hit the mountains at a specific point on I-40, the exact mile marker where the landscape shifted from red rocks to green trees. Susan had a photographic memory for roads and locations. It was this attention to detail that saved her, in a manner of speaking, when she drove through the identical stretch on I-20 in Louisiana in October of 2023. Susan was driving from Austin toward Jackson, Mississippi, hauling boxes of industrial equipment. She'd taken a slightly different route than usual, detouring south through Louisiana instead of going north and then east. She was on I-20 heading northeast toward Mississippi when she noticed the landscape. For the past 5 miles, she'd been passing through the same scenery repeatedly. An enormous oak tree on the left side of the highway, its branches spreading wide, gnarled and ancient. A red metal barn visible in the distance on the right. A particular curve in the road. A specific pattern of pine trees. These landmarks were repeating. Susan's mind cataloged them the first time she saw them, but then they appeared again in exactly the same sequence. And again. And again. Susan pulled over at the next rest area and got out of her truck. She walked to the edge of the highway and looked around. The landscape behind her looked identical to the landscape ahead. The same trees, the same barn, the same curve. Susan felt as if she was standing at the center of some kind of repeating loop. She pulled out her phone and opened her camera. She photographed the barn, the trees, the curve in the road. She noted the mile marker, 203. Susan got back into her truck and continued driving. She wanted to see when the pattern would break, when the landscape would change to something different. It didn't change. For the next 30 miles, Susan passed through the exact same series of landscapes. Mile marker 203 appeared on her right. Then she passed the oak tree, then the barn, then the curve. Then she came to mile marker 204, but 204 was immediately followed by 203, then 204 again. The mile markers were cycling backward and forward, creating an impossible pattern. Susan was driving forward at highway speed, but she was seeing the same locations repeatedly. Her GPS showed her making progress. Her odometer showed the miles accumulating. But her eyes were telling her something entirely different. Susan drove for another hour, watching the pattern repeat endlessly. Oak tree, barn, curve. Mile marker cycling through 203 and 204. Then suddenly she reached mile marker 205. The landscape shifted. The oak tree was gone. The barn was gone. The curve was different. Susan felt relief flood through her. She'd broken out of the loop. She'd driven through whatever strange phenomenon had trapped her and emerged on the other side. But as Susan continued driving, she realized that the landscape ahead was repeating in a different pattern now. New landmarks, new sequences. And behind her, when she checked her mirrors, she could see the previous pattern starting again. She was trapped between two different repeating loops. Susan pulled over at another rest area. She was shaking now. She wanted to understand what was happening to her. She pulled out her phone and called a number she'd seen on a trucker information board months earlier. It was a support line for truckers experiencing unusual phenomena on the highways. Susan had always dismissed it as a joke, some kind of prank line. But now she needed to understand. She called. A woman answered on the first ring. She introduced herself as Margaret. Margaret said, "Describe where you are and what you're experiencing." Susan told her everything, the repeating landscape, the impossible mile markers, the feeling of being trapped in loops. Margaret listened without interrupting. When Susan was done, Margaret said, "You've entered a distortion zone. There are several of them scattered across the highway system. Mostly they're harmless. They repeat patterns, they confuse drivers, but if you stay calm and keep driving, you'll eventually break through them and reach the other side." "How many of these zones are there?" Susan asked. "Dozens, maybe hundreds. Nobody knows exactly. They seem to form randomly and persist for years. Some have been active for decades. We're collecting data, trying to understand the phenomenon, but for now, the best advice is to keep driving, note the location, and report it to the National Trucker Network." Susan got the coordinates from Margaret and continued driving. She experienced 3 different repeating pattern zones before she finally broke through to normal highway. The ordeal lasted nearly 6 hours total. Susan completed her delivery, but she filed a formal report with the Trucker Network describing her experience in detail. She included photographs of the oak tree and the barn. She included the mile markers she'd documented. Susan never received any official response about her report, but on the CB, she began hearing other drivers talking about the identical stretch on I-20 in Louisiana. More and more truckers reported encountering it. Some experienced it as Susan had, with repeating landscapes and cycling mile markers. Others experienced different variations. But all of them confirmed that there was indeed something strange about that stretch of highway. Susan eventually took a different route whenever possible, adding hours to her deliveries rather than driving through that section of I-20 again. She remained convinced that the highway system contained areas that didn't follow normal rules of geography and physics. She spent the rest of her career avoiding those places and warning other drivers about them. Story 6. The Passenger Who Wasn't There. James Rodriguez had been driving trucks for 34 years. He was a careful driver who always followed regulations and maintained his focus on the road. He didn't engage in risky behavior. He didn't drive while exhausted. He maintained his truck meticulously. He was one of the safest drivers in the business. But in November of 2023, on a stretch of I-40 in Oklahoma, James picked up a passenger who shouldn't have been able to exist. James was driving alone, as he always did. His truck was a commercial vehicle, and while technically he could carry a passenger, he rarely did. He preferred the solitude of the road, the simple rhythm of driving, the peace that came from hours alone with his thoughts. But on this particular day, James pulled into a truck stop in the Oklahoma Panhandle and found a figure standing near the entrance. It was a woman, perhaps in her 50s, wearing outdated clothing. She looked at James expectantly. She seemed to be waiting for something. James considered driving on. She wasn't his responsibility. But there was something about her expression that suggested she was in distress. Against his better judgment, James approached her. "Are you okay?" James asked. The woman looked at him with eyes that seemed both present and distant at the same time. She said, "I'm trying to get to Albuquerque. Can you give me a ride?" James knew the regulations about carrying passengers in commercial trucks. Technically, he wasn't supposed to. But the woman looked vulnerable. He agreed to take her. She climbed into the passenger seat of his cab and they pulled back onto the highway. James tried to make conversation as he drove. He asked her name. She said, "Mary." He asked where she was from. She said, "Oklahoma." He asked where in Oklahoma. She said, "Here." James found her answers unsatisfying but continued driving anyway. Mary sat perfectly still in the passenger seat, staring directly ahead at the road. She didn't blink. She didn't move. She didn't respond to any other questions James asked. After a while, James stopped trying to make conversation and focused on driving. The road was straight and relatively empty. The landscape was flat with occasional trees and small hills breaking the horizon. James drove for 3 hours. Mary hadn't moved once. She hadn't asked for water, hadn't asked to use a bathroom, hadn't shifted position even slightly. Her eyes remained fixed on the road ahead. James was beginning to feel uncomfortable. He decided he would drop her off at the next major town. But before he reached a town, something strange happened. James blinked, and Mary was gone. The passenger seat was empty. James checked his mirrors, thinking she might have climbed out somehow. But there was no one behind him. The woman had simply vanished. James pulled over at the next rest area. He got out and walked around his truck. Mary was nowhere to be found. Her door had been locked. She couldn't have opened it from the inside without James hearing the mechanism. She couldn't have jumped out while the truck was moving without injuring herself. The woman had simply ceased to exist. James checked his logbook. He'd been driving for 3 hours and 52 minutes. The distance on his odometer matched the time and speed. He'd definitely been driving for that time period. But Mary had been gone for most of it. When had she left? How had she left? James tried to convince himself that he'd hallucinated the entire encounter. He was tired. He'd been driving for a long time. Sleep deprivation could cause hallucinations. But he was well rested. He'd slept 8 hours at his last stop. There was no logical reason for him to be experiencing hallucinations. Yet he couldn't explain where Mary had gone. James continued driving. He made it to Albuquerque as planned. He delivered his load. He showered at the truck stop and prepared to sleep. But that night, James couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about Mary, her unblinking eyes, her perfect stillness, the way she'd simply vanished. James decided to return to the truck stop where he'd picked her up. He backtracked his route on the return journey. When he reached the truck stop in Oklahoma, he pulled in and went inside. He showed the staff a sketch he'd drawn of Mary, asking if they'd ever seen her. The workers all said no. No one matching her description had been at the truck stop recently. James felt a chill run down his spine. How was it possible for him to have picked her up if no one else had seen her? James asked if anyone had recently gone missing in the area. The staff said there had been a woman who disappeared about 30 years ago. They showed James a faded photograph on an old bulletin board. It was Mary, the same face, the same clothing style. The photograph was dated 1993. James felt his reality fracturing. He'd picked up a woman who had disappeared 30 years ago. He'd driven her for nearly 4 hours, and then she'd vanished from his truck while he was driving. James left the truck stop and continued his delivery. He never spoke about the experience to anyone, but he quit driving within 6 months. He couldn't explain the encounter with Mary, and he was terrified it would happen again. He spent the rest of his life working at a desk job as far from the highway system as possible. The memory of Mary's unblinking eyes haunted him for decades. Story 7. The construction zone that never ended. Linda Chen had been driving trucks for 28 years. She was driving a Volvo VNL filled with retail merchandise destined for a warehouse in Memphis. It was December of 2023 and the roads were clear and dry. Linda was making good time on I-40 when she encountered a construction zone. The signs appeared suddenly. Lane closed, merge right, reduced speed. Linda slowed her truck and moved into the correct lane. The road ahead was narrowed, reduced from 4 lanes to 2. Orange and white construction barrels lined the highway. Traffic cones marked the reduced lanes. There were no visible construction workers, but that wasn't unusual. Nighttime construction often involved lane closures without active workers present. Linda maintained the reduced speed limit of 45 miles per hour as instructed. She was cautious, careful not to damage her truck. The construction zone appeared to extend for a considerable distance. Mile marker after mile marker passed. Linda was still in the construction zone, 5 miles, 10 miles, 20 miles. Normal construction zones didn't extend that far. They typically lasted for a few miles at most. Linda checked her GPS. It showed no construction zone at her current location. But the signs were clearly visible. The barrels were clearly present. The road was clearly narrowed. Linda continued driving. 30 miles into the construction zone, 40 miles. The landscape around her never changed. The same barrels, the same signs, the same narrow lanes. Other vehicles didn't appear ahead or behind. Linda was alone in the construction zone. She tried to take an exit, but the construction barrels and signs blocked all the exit ramps. She was trapped in the narrowed lanes, driving slowly, unable to escape. Linda used her CB to try to contact other drivers. She asked if anyone else was experiencing this extended construction zone. No one responded. The CB was eerily silent. Linda drove for 6 hours in that construction zone. She maintained the 45-mile-per-hour speed limit. She followed the signs exactly. She didn't try to run the barrels or attempt any unsafe maneuvers. And then, suddenly, after mile marker 237, the construction zone ended. The barrels disappeared. The signs vanished. The road opened back up to 4 lanes. Traffic appeared around her, vehicles that hadn't been visible moments before. Linda accelerated to normal highway speed. Linda pulled off at the next rest area and recorded what had happened in her logbook. She calculated the distance. She'd driven approximately 52 miles in the construction zone, maintaining a 45-mile-per-hour speed limit, which would have taken just over an hour. But her logbook showed that 2 hours and 40 minutes had passed. There was a missing hour and 40 minutes. Linda couldn't explain the discrepancy. She tried calling her dispatcher to report the anomaly, but Jerry was unconcerned. "Construction zones are just slow driving," Jerry said. "You took longer than you expected. That's not unusual." But Linda knew something else had happened. She knew time had been distorted somehow. The experience of driving through that zone had lasted longer than it should have. The physical distance matched her calculations, but the time didn't. Linda continued her delivery, but she was shaken by the experience. She took a different route on her return journey, adding hours to her drive in order to avoid that section of I-40. Linda never told anyone about the missing time. She knew how it would sound. But the experience convinced her that the highway system contained anomalies that couldn't be easily explained. She eventually retired early at age 57, unable to shake the feeling that something beyond her comprehension existed on the roads she'd been driving for so many years. Story 8. The Truck Stop That Rearranged. Thomas Wheeler had been driving trucks for 39 years. He was approaching the end of his career, planning to retire within the next few years. He was driving a Peterbilt filled with automotive parts from Detroit to New Orleans in January of 2024. Thomas had driven through a particular truck stop in Kentucky at least 500 times over his career. He knew the layout of the place perfectly. He could navigate it blindfolded. There was the main building with the diner and convenience store, fuel pumps in front, parking area in the back, showers on the east side of the main building, a small garage for minor truck repairs on the west side. This layout had been the same for at least 15 years. Thomas knew it as well as he knew his own home. Thomas pulled into the truck stop for fuel and a meal. It was 2 in the afternoon. The truck stop was moderately busy, with several trucks parked and a few drivers moving around. Thomas fueled his truck and went inside to use the bathroom and grab a coffee and sandwich. He ate in the diner, made conversation with a couple of other drivers he knew, and returned to his truck after about an hour. He was ready to get back on the road and cover the remaining distance to New Orleans before the day was done. Thomas got back in his truck and started the engine. He drove toward the exit, which was normally on the north side of the truck stop parking area. But he couldn't find the exit. He drove carefully through the parking area looking for the exit. The north side of the parking area was blocked by a fence. Thomas turned around and tried a different direction. The east side of the parking area was also blocked. Thomas was confused. The truck stop was suddenly enclosed in a way it had never been before. He'd spent the last hour inside the main building. The parking area couldn't have been significantly altered in that amount of time. Thomas drove slowly around the truck stop looking for any way out. The entire perimeter appeared to be enclosed by new fencing. Fencing that definitely hadn't been there an hour ago. Thomas parked his truck and went back inside the main building. He asked the receptionist about the new fence. The woman looked at him blankly. She said there was no new fence. The truck stop parking area had always been open on all sides. Thomas felt a cold chill run down his spine. He asked another driver who was standing near the counter. This driver also insisted there was no fence. "I just parked out there 15 minutes ago," the driver said, "and there's no fence. You feeling okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Thomas went back out to his truck and examined the perimeter carefully. The fence was definitely there. He could touch it. He could see it clearly. But apparently no one else could see it. Thomas tried driving through one section of fence, testing it. The fence was solid. His truck couldn't push through it. Thomas parked his truck in a central position and got out to walk the entire perimeter. As he walked, he noticed something strange. The fence seemed to be changing its position. When he walked to the north side, he'd remember the fence being on the east side where he was headed. When he walked to the east side, he'd remember the fence being on the south side. The fence was somehow maintaining its distance from him, always enclosing the parking area, always preventing exit but never in the same position relative to any fixed reference point. Thomas went back inside the truck stop and called his dispatcher. He explained what was happening. Jerry listened patiently and then suggested that Thomas find a motel nearby and get some sleep. "You're experiencing some kind of stress-induced confusion," Jerry said. "Take a break. You'll feel better after some rest." Thomas knew he was exhausted, but he also knew he wasn't experiencing confusion. Something was genuinely wrong with the truck stop. Something about the geometry of the place had changed. The layout that Thomas had known for 15 years was no longer accurate. Thomas decided to sit in his truck and wait. He believed that whatever was happening was temporary. The truck stop would return to normal. Thomas waited for 6 hours. The fence remained. The parking area remained enclosed. No other drivers seemed to notice anything unusual. Then, at 8 in the evening, Thomas's phone buzzed with a text from his dispatcher. "Clear to depart. You are having a hallucination due to exhaustion. Drive carefully." Thomas started his truck and pulled toward what he remembered as the south exit. This time, there was no fence. The exit was open. Thomas drove out onto the highway. When he looked in his mirrors, the truck stop appeared normal. The perimeter seemed open. The fence was gone. Thomas drove to a motel and took a room for the night. He couldn't explain what had happened at the truck stop. In the morning, he drove past the truck stop on his return route. It looked exactly as it always had. Open parking area, accessible from all sides. No fence, no enclosure. Thomas never stopped at that truck stop again. He took different routes specifically to avoid it, and he retired 3 months later, unable to shake the feeling that something had fundamentally changed about the world he'd known. Thomas never drove trucks again. He couldn't trust the landscape. He couldn't trust the places he'd thought he knew. And he couldn't explain to anyone else the shifting geometry of a truck stop that had been familiar for 15 years. Story 9. The Headlights That Wouldn't Turn Off. Harold Simpson had been driving trucks for 44 years. He was one of the oldest active truckers on the road. Most drivers retired in their 60s. Harold was 72 and still logging hundreds of thousands of miles every year. He was a man of routine and discipline. He drove the same routes repeatedly. He maintained his truck with obsessive precision. He kept his logbook perfectly accurate. Harold was driving a Volvo VNL from Portland to Phoenix in February of 2024. He was making good time on I-84 when his headlights began to behave strangely. Harold had stopped at a rest area to take a break. When he returned to his truck and started the engine, the headlights came on normally. He put the truck in gear and pulled back onto the highway. As he drove, he noticed that the headlights seemed unusually bright. He checked his dashboard. The headlight switch was on normal beam, not high beam. But the light illuminating the road ahead was intense, almost painfully bright. Harold assumed his headlights had been recently replaced and were simply of higher quality than his previous ones. He drove on, but over the next hour the headlights grew even brighter. They were casting such intense light ahead that the road seemed almost daytime bright, despite it being 2 in the morning. Harold turned the headlights off. Immediately the road became pitch black. He turned them back on. The intense light returned. Harold tried adjusting the brightness settings, but his truck had manual headlights without variable brightness options. The light was either on or off, and when it was on, it was devastatingly bright. Harold considered pulling over and checking the headlights, but something about the situation made him reluctant to stop. He had a sense that if he pulled over and turned off the engine, the headlights would somehow become even more intense. Harold continued driving. The headlights grew brighter. They were now so bright that the glare was beginning to hurt his eyes. He was squinting to see the road ahead. Harold tried wearing sunglasses while driving, but the glare penetrated even that protection. He had to slow his truck to a crawl to see the road through his watering eyes. Harold considered turning the headlights off completely and driving in darkness, but he was terrified of an accident. Despite the painful brightness, the headlights were still illuminating the road. Without them, he'd be driving blind. Harold pressed on. 30 miles, 40 miles. The headlights grew brighter and brighter. Harold was crying now, unable to keep his eyes open due to the intense glare. He was driving almost blind, barely able to see the road despite the brilliant illumination. The paradox was unbearable. He needed the light to see the road, but the light was preventing him from seeing anything. Then, somewhere around mile marker 340, the headlights suddenly went completely dark. They didn't turn off gradually. They simply extinguished instantly. Harold's truck was moving at highway speed through absolute darkness. Harold immediately hit the brake. He was still going 60 miles per hour as his truck began to slow. Harold couldn't see anything. Not the road, not the lane markers, not any obstacles. He was driving blind in a slowing truck. The brake lights behind him must be visible, Harold thought. If anyone was following, they'd see him braking and slow accordingly. Harold brought the truck to a stop on the shoulder of the highway. Harold sat in the complete darkness of his cab. His dashboard lights were off. His headlights were off. The entire world around him was black. Harold reached for his phone to use its light, but his phone was also dark. It had been fully charged when he started his drive. Now it was completely dead. Harold had a flashlight in his cab. He reached for it and clicked it on. The beam of light was so bright in the surrounding darkness that Harold had to squint. His flashlight was working normally, which meant the darkness around him wasn't absolute. It was more like the light was being somehow suppressed in this area. Harold decided to wait for dawn. He set his alarm for 6 in the morning and tried to sleep in his cab. But sleep wouldn't come. Harold was terrified. Something fundamental had changed about the highway around him. His truck's electrical system was behaving impossibly. His phone was dead. His normal electronic devices were failing. Harold stayed awake all night, listening to the sound of occasional cars passing in the darkness. When dawn came, Harold immediately checked his headlights. They worked normally. His phone turned back on. His dashboard lights functioned properly. Everything appeared to be functioning as it should. Harold checked his odometer. He'd traveled only 3 miles during the entire night. He'd been stationary, sitting on the shoulder of the highway, but his odometer showed 3 miles of travel. Harold didn't try to explain it to anyone. He completed his delivery to Phoenix and then asked his dispatcher to give him only daytime routes from that point forward. He couldn't face the idea of driving in darkness anymore. Harold worked for another 3 years on daytime routes before retiring. He was convinced that the darkness had changed something in him, had damaged something fundamental in his ability to trust the world around him. Story 10. The return route that took a different road. Kenneth Foster had been driving trucks for 41 years. He was an experienced driver who'd seen most of what the roads had to offer. He was careful and methodical. He maintained his trucks meticulously. He'd never had a serious accident or incident. Kenneth was driving a Peterbilt from Atlanta to Charlotte in March of 2024. It was a straightforward route that he'd driven at least 300 times. Kenneth knew every mile marker, every exit, every curve in the road. He could drive this route in his sleep, and he'd essentially done so many times after long stretches of highway driving. Kenneth completed his delivery in Charlotte without any difficulty. The load was unloaded by the warehouse staff. Kenneth received his confirmation of delivery. Everything appeared normal. He accepted a return load heading back to Atlanta. This load was fragile equipment that needed to be transported carefully, but Kenneth was confident in his ability to handle it. He checked his truck, ensured the load was secure, and began his return journey. Kenneth had driven maybe 5 miles out of Charlotte when he noticed something odd. The landscape looked different. He was familiar with this stretch of highway. He knew what it should look like. There were particular landmarks. A small diner on the right side of the highway about 8 miles from the warehouse. A Baptist church visible in the distance on the left side. A curve in the road where the landscape became particularly hilly. But he wasn't seeing those landmarks. Instead, he was seeing terrain that was much flatter, and there was a coastline visible in the distance. Kenneth was confused. Charlotte was inland. There was no coastline. Kenneth was certain he was heading south on I-85 toward Atlanta, but the landscape was suggesting he was somewhere else entirely. Kenneth pulled over at the next rest area and checked his GPS. The GPS showed him heading south on I-85, approaching mile marker 200. But his eyes were telling him that he was near a coast. There were trees that suggested a warmer, more humid climate. The sky had a different quality to it. Kenneth got out and walked around. The rest area itself looked normal, but beyond the rest area, the landscape was fundamentally wrong for his location. Kenneth got back in his truck and continued driving, trusting his GPS more than his eyes. Kenneth drove for another hour and covered approximately 60 miles according to his odometer. His GPS showed him at mile marker 140. But when Kenneth looked at the mile markers on the road, they showed mile marker 270. His GPS and his observation of the mile markers were giving him contradictory information. Kenneth was 230 miles apart in 2 different systems. Kenneth tried to reconcile this, but the numbers simply didn't work. Kenneth took an exit and stopped at a small truck stop to get his bearings. He went inside and asked the worker behind the counter where he was. The worker said, "This is the Soco Gap truck stop, I-40. Kenneth felt his blood run cold. I-40? He'd been driving south on I-85. He shouldn't be on I-40. But when he checked his route, he realized that this truck stop was indeed on I-40. Somehow his truck had left I-85 and gotten onto I-40 without him realizing it. But Kenneth hadn't taken an exit. He'd been driving straight. He'd only stopped for rest areas which were directly on the highway. Kenneth considered calling his dispatcher but decided against it. He was beginning to understand that there was no rational explanation for what was happening. His truck had somehow traveled to a different highway without him taking any exit. Kenneth continued driving on I-40, heading west toward Atlanta. The landscape continued to be wrong. It suggested a geographical location that didn't match where his GPS said he was. Kenneth eventually made it back to Atlanta and delivered his load. He didn't report the incident. He simply accepted that the highway system had somehow rerouted him without his knowledge or consent. Kenneth continued driving for another 2 years before retiring. He remained convinced that the route between Atlanta and Charlotte had changed in some fundamental way. He began avoiding that particular route, taking longer paths instead. Kenneth eventually retired at age 64 and moved to a small town in the mountains of Tennessee. He never spoke about the incident to anyone, but it haunted him for the rest of his life. Kenneth was convinced that the highway he'd known for 41 years was no longer the same highway. It had become something else. Something that followed its own rules and didn't conform to the maps and signs that supposedly guided drivers. And somewhere out there, he believed other truckers were discovering the same truth, that the highways of America were not simple roads from point A to point B. They were something far more complex and mysterious. Something that existed partially outside normal geography and logic. Kenneth died in his sleep at age 87, still wondering what had really happened on that return route from Charlotte.